So even though the stated goal is to talk about technology, vehicle technology, how it can improve road safety, my real objective is to avoid Karen's 30-second card. So, and I think even though the theme is really about autonomous vehicles, subtitle text is getting the driver safely out of the equation. So this brief presentation provides a snapshot of the regulatory considerations surrounding automated and connected vehicles for those like me who are involved in motor vehicle administration. I'll speak to the way all levels of government are engaged in this dynamic and begin by referencing both the work of CCMTA and AMVA have undertaken in this area in support of our respective members' jurisdictions. But in addition to vehicle registration, driver licensing, and law enforcement, I'll touch on safety testing, security insurance, and other regulatory considerations. So the autonomous vehicle and connected vehicle area is evolving at such a pace that staying informed, avoiding duplication, and learning from others are essential for regulators. To date, the CCMT working group has held a workshop for government and industry and created several practical tools and resources to support Canadian jurisdictions. We've provided a jurisdictional checklist for testing and deployment, surveyed jurisdictions on their activities related to autonomous vehicles, and provided communication products, key messaging, and web content to ensure consistency in how the various jurisdictions speak to the issues surrounding deployment and testing. Earlier this year, CCMTA produced a white paper highlighting key considerations, benefits, and challenges, as well as what other countries leading in the area are working on. The next key deliverable for CCMTA includes developing a set of guidelines that Karen mentioned. But as AMVA, that working group is also doing that same work. We're going to wait for the AMVA work to complete and then turn a Canadian lens on that effort. So next month, the AMVA working group is having a further face-to-face meeting, and we anticipate having a draft report ready for sharing in August, which the CCMTA group will be able to start working with. And AMVA's plans is to publish their report publicly in December of this year. So from a regulator perspective, autonomous vehicle area is a shared responsibility. So federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal levels of government each have a responsibility regarding their introduction. So the federal government, via Transport Canada, is responsible for standards and regulations for new and imported vehicles, and this would include any regulations specific to automated vehicles. And Transport Canada is also responsible for keeping vehicle manufacturers accountable for safety standard compliance. Federal government acts as a facilitator for international and national collaboration on AV adoption, example being this conference. Provincial and territorial governments are responsible for creating the legislative framework for effective testing and deployment within their own jurisdictions. And the provinces and territories will need to incorporate federal regulatory requirements to help oversee vehicle safety, registration, and regulate driver licensing and insurance. And we'll also need to adapt infrastructure to support this deployment. And municipalities will also be engaged in executing the legislative and regulatory framework built for the adoption of automated vehicles. So what we do is important, but it's also what we don't do is important as well. So concerns among regulators ultimately have landed on two key principles that guide how we work. So we don't want to create a regulatory patchwork to make things more complicated for manufacturers, but we should be working towards consistency, efficiency, and effectiveness from a motor vehicle administrator perspective, and I know Jeff will attest to this. And second, we don't want to be an obstacle to the early and safe introduction of this technology that has the capacity to reduce injuries and fatalities. So not a patchwork and not an obstacle. In fact, I believe we have a responsibility to help build public awareness and confidence in the technology to support adoption and begin yielding the benefits. So through discussions of the AV working groups, there are clear areas of need for regulatory amendment enabling, but the work should be strategic. So our coordinating lead agency should be identified because of the cross-disciplinary implications, impacts, and effects. It also reduces duplication of effort. So once a lead agency is active, they'll need to ensure a committee is formed comprised of jurisdictional participants and stakeholders with some element of responsibility. So what's here is an incomplete list, but you get the idea. Autonomous vehicles and connected vehicles are interconnected literally and figuratively, and we know that the minimum following representation should be included in any ongoing and consultation work. So we've got Motor Vehicle Administration, jurisdictions, Department of Transportation, law enforcement, information technology, insurance regulators, passenger transportation, healthcare, aging and disabled communities, transit and tolling authorities. And other external stakeholders would include transportation research centers, the manufacturing industry, and road user groups such as those responsible for pedestrian and cycling communities. So testing of autonomous vehicles has a significant component of regulatory structure. Testing on public roads by manufacturers is regulated through provincial, territorial, and state jurisdictions. And among our Canadian jurisdictions, only Ontario has really put a place in the regulatory framework to support testing, although there's indications that Alberta is heading in this direction with a recent announcement regarding a pilot low-speed autonomous shuttle service in 2018 to provide a last-mile connection between its Zoo LRT station and the Spark Science Centre. So required components of a testing program would include establishing what an application process and content would be, a process to review and accept or reject applications, and how we are administrating that, requirements imposed on the manufacturer, such as regular reporting or incident reporting. What's the permitting process? Where will the testing be permitted to occur? Everywhere, limited locations. Establishing requirements for the submission of evidence of insurance or self-insurance for manufacturers testing AVs, as well as ensuring that they meet certain safety requirements under all weather conditions or under particular conditions that they intend to test the vehicle. And turning to deployment, I'll break this regulatory aspect into three basic components. The main three lenses that we apply as regulators fall into the following buckets: vehicle registration, driver licensing, and law enforcement. So I'll walk through these areas, beginning with vehicle registration and licensing. So that gets into such things as titling and branding, or certainly registration as opposed to titling in Canada. Branding of aftermarket automation by a third party. Do we mark or identify these vehicles through special license plates or other means? What will be the requirements of manufacturers as it relates to the certificate of origin or new vehicle information statement, the vehicle's birth certificate? Financial responsibility or insurance and minimum limits. And here there's definitely an issue of disparity, particularly in the U.S., that can have some very low minimum limits of insurance, like $25,000, which will not be adequate. Regulation as it relates to federal compliance, system monitoring and performance. Under driver licensing and examination and administration, what about driver testing? Some have said that we should be turning off what can be turned off, but does that introduce a liability exposure if the applicant has a crash that may have otherwise been avoided if the technology had been on during the exam? Examiners will need to be familiar with the technology so they can determine if the examinee is responding appropriately to the technology. They need to be aware of all technological types of intervention and operator notification. What about the legal requirement of a licensed operator in the vehicle? Testing versus deployment and high versus full automation. So clearly, vehicles that are fully automated, there's an opportunity for and there's no opportunity for the occupant to intervene, there should be no licensing requirement, and that goes to the ability for those with limiting disabilities not being able to drive. And will we need to revisit the existing classes of driver licensing? And obviously we'll need to revisit distracted driving laws to allow the driver to perform other activities while the vehicle is in autonomous mode. Turning to law enforcement, some of the issues that are of interest to law enforcement include crash incident reporting and data event recording, the content requirements, which will help in their investigations, criminal activity, so recognition of hazards are easier for an occupant to aim and fire a weapon if the vehicle is in autonomous mode, or movement of criminal goods. Distracted driving, as it relates to the ability for the driver to take back control when the vehicle is transitioning that way. New enforcement penalties, they need to identify and define them. For testing, failing to produce a permit where the jurisdiction requires it, or failing to comply with the permit restrictions. And for deployed vehicles, vehicle system tampering, data corruption, failure of directional reference data where the vehicle goes off the road due to GPS failure. Would that be a manufacturer, driver? Who gets ticketed? And they're also concerned about first responder safety. So the ability to identify or badging of these vehicles so that appropriate and safe response and action can take place, such as immobilizing the vehicle or disabling it if it's at a crash site. There needs to be responder training programs. And there need to be more standardized traffic control with cones, flare patterns, human hand direction, so that it's easier for autonomous vehicles to deal with those situations. Response to emergency vehicles and other vehicles displaying flashing lights, where the operator, or I guess an autonomous vehicle, would need to respond in a certain way, allowing the passing. Further on criminal use, the use of commission in a crime such as drugs transporting or terrorism. So certainly lots of work on the law enforcement front. So as regulators, other areas that touch on these prior buckets include maintaining vehicle safety regulation, traffic laws, implications for infrastructure, building information and communications technology, ensuring privacy, insurance and liability again, transitioning, encouraging innovation, education, and awareness. So in the next few slides, I'll speak briefly to these. So another consideration for regulators concerning rules of the road, although this overlaps with the previous discussion on law enforcement. But while deployment of autonomous vehicles will lead to fewer traffic collisions, their broad introduction will still require appropriate traffic law revisions. So both driving offenses such as an impaired, except for fully autonomous vehicles, and distracted driving, the allowance of handheld device while in autonomous mode, and tailgating. And should there be any discretion for an autonomous vehicle to be capable of operating contrary to traffic law, for example, above the posted speed limit by some minimal defensible amount, where the speed limit is 80 km and traffic slowing between 85 and 90, or to cross a double solid line at the direction of a peace officer. With respect to safety, again, Transport Canada plays a key role here. So while current motor vehicle safety standards don't restrict the introduction of partly automated vehicles in Canada, new federal requirements will be needed as many vehicles become more automated. All regulation requiring operating autonomous vehicles is responsibility of provincial and territorial governments. We'll need to ensure regulatory requirements are in place to make sure automated vehicle technology performs as intended and required. This will be a collaborative effort between the manufacturers and vehicle servicing industry. And we need to ensure that entities installing aftermarket automated technology in vehicles don't disable federally required safety systems or downgrade their operation. We'll need to address technical infrastructure support elements Certainly communication supporting infrastructure will need to be in place to gain the maximum benefits for vehicle connectivity. But there could be in-road elements, on-road, and above-ground components that are supportive, especially of connected vehicle technology benefits, and that's of high and key interest for traffic engineers. Certainly, technology-filled vehicles will be sharing and connecting data constantly. Once connected vehicles and autonomous vehicles are deployed, they'll broadcast real-time data, raising a number of privacy and security concerns. So driver and vehicle systems will need the assurance that incoming and outgoing data is dependable and secure. Insurance companies are grappling with the concept of liability coverage for autonomous vehicles. And while a number of manufacturers have said they're willing to accept full liability for vehicles that have reached full automation or operating in autonomous mode, there will be a gap in liability coverage for semi-autonomous vehicles. Legislative amendments will likely be needed to clarify liability under various automation levels, environments, and conditions. And as I mentioned, there's going to be some issues around what the existing limits are and are they adequate for this type of technology. So some other considerations, educating consumers about the vehicle systems and technologies that have been identified is a key priority for Canadian jurisdictions and the automobile industry associations, and will be important for us to address and support as regulators. Outreach and education tools are necessary to inform and raise public awareness so that we can start, again, achieving the benefits of this technology as early as possible. So lastly, it's a major shift and represents significant change for the public, industry, and regulators. And for regulators, a good approach would be to maintain open channels, share information, learn what we can to avoid duplication, and the work done to date has identified and addressed some of those issues. And there's also another bit of work, a bit of a deeper dive effort going on with the National Cooperative Highway Research Program, where they're looking at actual motor vehicle codes, and they're going to be coming up with some recommendations. So it'll go further than what the CCMT AMVA work, but we're plugged in on that, and we'll be keeping track.